The mist had come in through the window, diffusing the grey light of no particular time of day. I was lying on the floor. I had been there long enough to stiffen. Some of the time I had been unconscious. The rest I had just been getting colder. It was my mother's house. I'd gone back to stay there. I do that when I'm at the bottom of a low, but I shouldn't. Particularly when the house is not actually my mother's, but just a derelict one that feels a bit like it. Towards the end, she had no windows either. This one also had broken doors and only some of its floors. I'd started this low by hanging around the bars of theme pubs, conspicuously dosing myself with Rohypnol and waiting for someone to drug rape me. I'd scored it on credit off a minicab driver who thought himself a successful rapist. He was foolish enough to trust me because of my accent. Of course, I had no real proof it was Rohypnol, but whatever it was wearing off now, and I was checking to see whether anyone had pleasured me in the last 24 hours, and then there was a knock on the main plank across the front door. I pushed my head through a broken pane in Mother's front sitting room. A young cyclist stared back at me with a smug grin and a silver envelope. "It's an invitation to Susie's wedding," he said. I told him she had a pretty odd way of accepting a proposal. He laughed one ha. I told him how Susie had kissed me and how shortly after I had proposed to her in a letter enclosed in a sea bass. She hadn't replied exactly, but she had thrown it into the sea, which perhaps was a posh way of saying yes. He looked dubious. "The posh do things differently," I said. He suggested that perhaps I open the envelope. Inside was an invitation in illegible copperplate, a red card in quilted silk with a pair of alloy lovebirds canoodling in the centre and a handwritten note that read, "Come at once. I must talk to you at once. Susie X." Susie's house was a bustle of caviar and champagne, and about a dozen female strangers with familiar faces. She kissed me all over the place, gushed, "You know everyone, of course," and left me facing a wall. I stayed that way because it felt safe. I could hear her bustling around, busily issuing "we musts" and fetching congratulations. "We always knew it would be him," they said. "It's because she understands me," I thought. Susie's voice swept over my shoulder. "And you, my darling, will give me away." She squeezed me through my trousers. I turned towards the noise. She looked suddenly intense. "You know how much I love Daddy, and now he's dead. Well, I need someone special, and I wondered if perhaps it could be you." And then she added, "You are by far the oldest looking of my friends." She smiled again, and her eyes done a sexy. "So, are you marrying me?" I said. "Sort of. Shouldn't I have given you a ring?" She looked kinder now than a village baker lady and kissed me softly on the forehead. "You'll be standing right next to me," she said. "It's just standing up in front of people for a while." As she receded and I renewed my congress with the wall, the room around me hummed and crackled with talk of men. In particular, a man called William, and a broken memory surfaced like a puff of something half gone and awful. A crass, beaming face. Too much nodding. Susie laughing, nudging me and saying, "Sometimes you should laugh like William." And slowly, without knowing why, I began to feel about as sad as it is possible to feel while staring at a wall in a room full of women. 3 or 4 times in the next 6 months, Susie had me round for a feed. People were unusually nice to me, especially William, who, having materialised, looked older in the face than the memory, but still boomed at me excitedly and slapped my back whenever possible. Otherwise, life continued in the usual blur of frowns, doctors, lying down, and people saying, "Get the fuck out of my garden." And then suddenly we were all in a church surrounded by fields. I was stood next to Susie and William. Behind us, a stew of faces. At the altar were 2 priests, both in informal robes, like kimonos. Both were thin, and both, I learned later, had AIDS. Julius was gay. Crispin had an unlucky transfusion. Later still, I found that it wasn't unlucky at all. He'd deliberately taken on contaminated blood because he believed that underneath he was intrinsically a promiscuous homosexual and felt guilty that he'd never had the nerve to do anything about it. Both priests looked similar, but you could tell them apart because all the girls loved Julius. To begin with, Julius did most of the talking, almost chatting and smiling infrequently in our direction. I couldn't hear all the words above the drumming that generally bothers me on large occasions, but whenever he raised his voice I felt obliged to say, "Not bad thanks, how are you?" He smiled kindly when I did this. When Crispin took over, he turned his attention increasingly to Susie and William, and became more solemn and started holding their hands. At one point I heard him say, "Let him speak now, or forever hold his peace." There was a silence. Susie winked at me. William smiled, and a little git of panic broke onto my diaphragm. "Who gives this woman to this man?" said Crispin. Susie looked at me again. I looked at Crispin, at William, and a man next to him holding a ring, and I began to see with the clarity of cold gin where this one was going. I said nothing. "Who gives this woman to this man?" Crispin said again. I knew what I had to say, but the only way I could think of saying "I do" was to say "fucked if" first. I just stared back at them, trapping the response in my mouth so tight my lips ached. So Susie jabbed me in the cummerbund, which made me say "Waddy." It was good enough for them. They continued. I didn't want that. I made a longer noise. Crispin stopped. I made it again and slapped my face to add importance. He looked worried. "Is there a problem?" he whispered. The stained glass behind him, which included, at Susie's insistence, a panel featuring the Rolling Stones as 5 of the 12 apostles, began to rotate and was joined by the nave and transept. I heard my voice say, "Yes," and I agreed with it. His eyes widened. "I have a problem with this marriage," I blurted. "What?" said the priest. William's face flared a gale warning, and Susie looked appalled, but was unable to suppress a slight wiggle. "The problem," I seemed to be saying, "is William." At the back someone cheered. Relatives gasped in disbelief. William gave me a warning grunt, and I remembered everything. I remembered young versions of William and myself, and 4 others who escorted Susie. I remembered how people called us her brood, how she had always confided that of the 6, it was me whom she'd genuinely earmarked for marriage. How sometime during all of this I had flown off the thread and had collapsed too far even to realise how far I had collapsed. So here I was, staring at William, the dullard, the dependable, whose moderate fortune now stood him proudly above all his time-debauched peers, and who most importantly of all would be too far loyal to suspect Susie's affairs. "What is your objection?" Crispin was saying. I pointed at William. "He is a tit," I said. Silence. 3 or 4 male laughs, immediately stifled by female glares. 1 female laugh, unrestrained. Objections. A priest whispering, "Fuck." Rough hands tight around my biceps, under my arms, my knees. Sudden jagged daylight lying on my back and 4 angry male faces, dark against the sun. One of them I recognised as William's brother, all of them ranting about smashing my head in, then 3 girls joining in saying, "No, no, he needs help," and eventually all of them compromised with beating me up with drugs. I remember nothing of the reception. Apparently I was swaddled in Egyptian cotton in a bedroom upstairs. Apparently William came up to say, "No hard feelings," and I tried to push him out of a window. Susie herself had told me later that her grandmother had paid me a kindly visit, and I told her how Susie and Imogen had once used bacon to make Granny's Doberman lick their vaginas.